I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Mayor Krieger, and this is one of our lectures about sleep and sleep disorders. One of the I've only been in the United States for about 8 years. I moved here from Canada, and one of the shocking things when I arrived and I started to see pediatric cases at Yale Sleep Medicine was I was seeing a very large number of kids who were very sleep deprived, because of the educational system. They were getting up very early, sometimes 5:30 in the morning, in order to catch a bus an hour later to get to school, which often started between 7 and 8 o'clock in the morning. And I had meetings with school systems. I spoke to school superintendents about specific cases that had trouble with their schedule, and I got zero sympathy, and nobody wanted to change anything because of football and football practice and sports that was going on later on in the afternoon. And so that's been, that whole topic is one that's been very important to me. And luckily here at Yale about a year and a half ago, we got a pediatric sleep person, Canapari, that I'm going to introduce in a minute, and he comes to us from Harvard, and he decided to come up in the world and come here to Yale. He's going to talk to us about adolescent sleep and that it's in crisis. And we also have a visitor today who is also going to talk to us, Terra Ziporyn Snider, who also has this as her passion, and we're going to start right now. Come on up, Craig.
I don't think you were prepared coming from Canada for the legendary prowess of Connecticut football teams, known throughout the nation. You know what's funny is I've known Terra for about 3 years through the wonder of social media, but we spoke for the first time maybe about 6 weeks ago and met for the first time today. So it's an interesting world we live in. So today we're going to be talking about teenage sleep. Not to give anything away, but there's a lot of problems with it. So the usual disclosures, sign in if you want CME, you have no conflicts of interest. So our goals today, we're going to review how few teenagers are getting enough sleep and why so many of them are sleep deprived. Talk about the effects of chronic sleep deprivation in teenagers, recognizing we're really preaching to the choir with people in this audience. Talk about the historical reasons which have put us here. And finally, review the importance of starting schools later and the difficulties associated with achieving this. So, about 10% of students right now are getting adequate sleep. This was from a study published last year by the CDC. They surveyed about 12,000 students for 4 years over the course of high school. The CDC defined adequate sleep in teenagers as greater than 9 hours of sleep per night, or equal to. Those of us who work with kids know that that's a pipe dream. Although teenagers, of course, probably need between 8.5 and 9.5 hours of sleep every night. If you say, well, we're going to accept 8 hours of sleep as being adequate, we're still looking at about 29% of girls and 34% of boys getting adequate sleep at night. It's really unacceptable. There are a lot of consequences to chronic sleep deprivation I'm going to be talking about in a little bit. One of the findings of this study, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later on, is that students pass through high school, they become more and more sleep deprived. So this is showing 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grades. Interestingly, girls seem to get less sleep than boys. I'm not really sure why that is, actually. So those gender differences seem to even out by the 11th and 12th grade, where you're having about 4% of kids getting adequate sleep in the last 2 years of high school. There was an article in Pediatric that was published earlier this year called The Great Sleep Recession. And this was from a large study where they actually surveyed 272,000 students in a birth cohort going from 1973 to the year 2000. I kind of get a kick out of this because I was born in 1973. So I guess I'm still relevant. I did not participate in the study, however. And again, they found that the amount of sleep that teenagers were getting declines with age and is reduced over time. So just to parse this graph, in this study, they defined 7 hours of sleep as being adequate sleep. Or just for the purpose of the study, asking teenagers, are you getting, on average, 7 hours of sleep or more at night? As you can see, as the teenagers get older, they get less and less sleep. Now, this is showing, the effect of, when these data were taken. So this was taken in 1991. The dark line is the most recent from 2011 to 2012. In this survey, part of the survey right here, they asked teenagers, do you think you're getting adequate sleep on school nights? And as you can see, by age 18, about 20% of them are saying that they think they're getting adequate sleep. Because of the large numbers in this study, they could actually tell us some very interesting things about this data. So on the left, you just see the proportion of students getting 7 hours of sleep or more at night, which drops over high school. We already know that. And they talk about both a cohort and a period effect. So this is the cohort effect here. They selected 1980 as the reference cohort, students born in 1980, simply because they have a lot of students born in that year. And what they found was that students born in 1980 actually got less sleep than students born earlier. And interestingly, in those birth groups, they seem to get a little bit more sleep and then less. And then they looked at the period effect. So 1995 was the year they had the most surveillance, the most people that they surveyed. And they found essentially since then, students are getting less and less sleep over time, since 1995. So why are teens so sleep deprived? This is an interesting problem, and it occurs at the intersection of biology and sociology. I really think there are 4 major factors. There's a circadian biology, the effect of screens. We're going to talk a little bit about the effect of homeworks, but that's somewhat controversial. And finally, school start times. So this is going to be reviewed to some of you guys, but there's a famous model in sleep medicine about why you fall asleep and why you're awake at a certain time, called the 2-process model. The first part of the model is called the homeostatic sleep drive. And this is really easy to understand. So you start off when your sleep drive is low. The longer you're awake, it gets higher and higher. You go to bed, you fall asleep, and it goes down again. The other part of it is the circadian drive, which in this context is best understood as a wakefulness drive. And essentially, the circadian wakefulness drive keeps you awake in the late afternoon and the evening, so you're not just taking a series of cat naps after you've been awake for 5 or 6 hours. It drops off a few hours before bedtime, and that coincides with when the body starts producing more melatonin, what's called the dim light melatonin onset. So teenagers have a physiologic delay in their body clocks, even if school gets earlier. So essentially, the wakefulness signal moves later. You have a teenager that when they were a younger kid might have gone to bed at 8 or 9. All of a sudden, their biological bedtime is around 11 o'clock. Simultaneous with this, school gets earlier. So their sleep period is curtailed, and it's curtailed at both ends. Essentially, you have the biological factors pushing their bedtime later, and you have school getting earlier. How can we influence the circadian drive? This is often the thing that we try to manipulate in clinic just to try to eke out a little bit more sleep in our teenagers who are struggling. You can get earlier sleep onset with morning light exposure or exercise. Morning exercise is pretty difficult if you're already struggling to get up in the morning to get to school on time. Melatonin in the early evening can also shift your body clock early. Later sleep onset occurs at the onset of puberty. Evening light exposure and evening exercise all move it later. Why do I highlight evening light exposure? It's because of the effect of technology. And I think if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, there was no iPhone 10 years ago. I mean, if you're lucky, you had a Palm Pilot, right? It had one of those flat screens that didn't really emit any light. Kids still had television in the room, and we know that that's corrosive to sleep. But, in my opinion, I don't think a television that's about 10 or 15 feet from you is nearly as corrosive to sleep as a bright screen that's about a foot or 2 from your face. So this is from a survey actually from 2012 where they asked respondents, how many of you don't sleep well because of technology, specifically smartphones, tablets, etc.? Notice the trend that the 18 to 24-year-old age group had much more of an effect on this than older people. Unfortunately, they did not survey high school age students, but I wonder, judging from my patient population, it might look like this. Now, I just want to ask you guys, you're all sleep experts here, so where do you keep your cell phone at night? Do you keep it in a different room? Okay.
I turned it off.
So turning it off is good too. So you're 65 plus. If you're 65 plus, not saying that you are. Now, how about if you keep it in your bedroom but you can't reach it from your bed? Anyone? Don't be ashamed. You know, it's okay. So not many people. How about in bedroom within reach of your bed? Okay. Shame on you, Claude. Yeah, interestingly, this seems to be basically 18 to 44. Any of you guys have one of these? I did when I was a kid. It was really cool. It's the Sony Dream Machine. Kids these days do not have clock radios. They use their phones as their alarm. And one of the interventions we do in sleep clinic is we say, please buy a clock radio for your kid so they don't have the phone next to their bed. The fact is, these devices are addictive. Every application on your phone is trying to get you to check it. Your social media feeds, your email, your text messages, they all want you to look at them. And you know what? They're pretty effective. So I just want to briefly talk about homework. Tara and I were just discussing how the educational literature is very different from the medical literature. And essentially, it's hard to control for things like test scores when there's so many variables in play. It seems as though the amount of homework that kids get over time overall has remained relatively flat. However, I would say anecdotally that the students in the upper echelon who are, say, taking AP classes have way more homework than they did 10 or 20 years ago. It is very common in my practice to talk to teenagers taking AP classes who have an hour of homework per night per class, per AP class, with workloads of 3 to 5 hours of homework a night, on top of extracurriculars, etc. I remember when I was in Boston, I had a kid come in to me who went to Boston Latin High School, and he would finish his homework around midnight. And he had to get on the school bus at 6:15 in the morning. And he said to me, can you give me a medication so I can fall asleep within 15 minutes and so I can get 5.5 hours of sleep at night? I mean, when you hear stories like that, and that's an extreme case, but I hear stories of this all the time, of teens who their lives are not designed in such a way where they can get adequate sleep. And I will say in passing that the U.S. is a relatively homework-intense country compared to others. Many of the countries where we think of having the most educational school systems, Japan, Finland is one actually. There's such a romance with the Finnish education system now. Those students have in high school about half an hour of homework a night. Countries like Greece and Iran have very heavy homework loads. I don't know if you'd rather be more like Finland or Iran, instead of, but I don't really have much control over that. Sure.
What about you kind of mentioned the extracurricular activities and overscheduling of kids? I mean, having multiple sports, and I know my daughter doesn't start homework until like 9 o'clock at night usually. So, any studies on that or thoughts?
Well, I don't know if Tara's going to comment on that or not. I mean, I think that has been much more of a trend, a real push away from kids to have unstructured time and just filling with activities for students that are trying to get into competitive colleges. I'm not familiar with the data on that, but I think Tara's going to talk about that a little bit. So I'm just going to close by talking about the consequences of chronic sleep deprivation in teenagers. Of course, it extends to little kids and adults as well, but we're talking specifically about teens. There's 3 domains I'm going to talk about: health, behavioral, and mental. Sorry, that formatted weirdly, and academic. So essentially, there's overlap, obviously, between academic and health and behavioral, et cetera, but just to tease them out a little bit. Health consequences. Increased risk of obesity. Sleep curtailment is clearly associated with increased caloric intake and junk calories, refined sugars. Cardiovascular morbidity, specifically increased blood pressure and also a decreased drop in blood pressure during sleep, just like in sleep apnea. Metabolic dysfunction, specifically problems with glycemic control and problems with high cholesterol. Increased use of caffeine. I mean, don't get me wrong, I just had a cup of coffee, but you probably don't want your high school age kid having like 5 or 6 Red Bulls during the day and then being unable to fall asleep at night. It just sort of compounds the difficulty they have. Diversion of controlled drugs. This is actually very common. A lot of schools, very competitive schools, in prep schools, et cetera, where there is a black market in medications like Ritalin and NMO. The increased risk of car accidents. Statistically speaking, the biggest risk to a teenager of dying is in a car accident. And let's be real here. Teenagers are terrible drivers to begin with. Now, we know that drowsy driving is like drunk driving. It's very clear in sleep literature. However, our teenagers get the message they're not supposed to drive drunk, and yet we've structured their lives in such a way they're driving in a sleep-deprived way all the time. And the fact is, early school start times are associated with an increased risk of accident between 30 and 70%, depending on what study you look at. This is just one study I thought was an interesting diagram. This author has published a number of studies looking at different counties that are similar to one another in terms of demographics, in terms of geography, and what the influence of school start times is. In this particular study, I believe this is in Maryland, wasn't it?
It's Virginia.
It's Virginia, yeah. In Chesterfield County has 7:20 a.m. school start time. Henrico's got an 8:45 school start time. First of all, this is when the students are having the accidents. Chesterfield, they go to school earlier, they get out earlier. There's also a lot more accidents in the town with earlier school start times. And the fact that this is a problem for the whole community. But, the teenagers aren't just running off the road, they're running into other cars. This is a public safety issue. Mental and behavioral consequences. Anxiety. Decreased motivation. Poor impulse control. I mean, again, are teenagers known for their impulse control? I mean, not particularly. And having short sleep is associated with increased drug use, increased sexual activity, increased bad decision-making. Emotional problems. Suicidality. Suicidal thoughts are 10 times more common in sleep-deprived teenagers. Depression. Increased vulnerability to stress. Academic consequences are considerable. And this is important to consider when we think about why do we send kids to school? So they can learn. Problems with complex problem solving. Again, what are you supposed to be doing in school? But solving problems. Attentional and memory problems. So essentially, kids that are sleep deprived look like kids with ADHD. Just like kids with sleep disorders look like they have ADHD. Problems like executive function. Again, going back to the problem with impulse control. The fact is we know that executive function is as strongly associated with success as IQ. Problems with attendance. And just one thing about problems with attendance, I remember there's one school district in the north of Boston where kids would get failed out of a class if they were tardy 3 times in a semester. So, and this school system had a rotating schedule, meaning that kids that were having troubles getting out of bed would fail their year unless they had a doctor's note, because 15 minutes of tardiness, so 5 minutes in 3 classes, would result in them failing the class for the semester. It's absolutely crazy. And higher dropout rates, again, partly due to issues like that. I'm just going to close with a quote from Judy Owens. If you knew that your child's school there's a toxic substance that reduces the capacity to learn, increased chances of a car crash, and maybe like that 20 years from now he'd be obese and suffer from hypertension, you do everything possible to get rid of that substance and not worry about cost. Early school start times are toxic. And last year the AP actually recommended that school start times start no later than 8:30 in the morning. So at this point I'm going to pass the baton over to Terra.
Well, good afternoon. Of course, Judy Owens' quote is music to my ears. First of all, good afternoon, and thank you, Fred, for inviting me, and Meyer for hosting this. I am now going to take this conversation and narrow it to the school start time issue, since Fred set it up for me so nicely. But I do feel a little bit of an obligation to explain why we should focus on this single factor when clearly there are many factors at work, and you've heard about most of them already. I think I added a couple other possible culprits here. And of course all of these factors play a role, and none of them is a magic bullet fix for the teen sleep crisis, and some of these might not even be changeable. But I think one of the things that helps understand the focus on school start times is to take the factors that you might be able to change and recognize that they can be divided into two basic categories. Some of these are individual problems or individual roots of the problem where if you're going to fix them, you fix a person. And these would be things like sleep hygiene, poor sleep hygiene, or an underlying sleep disorder. But a number of the other problems that Craig identified would be structural roots of the problem, and there are larger problems that you can't address on an individual basis. There are problems in society at large. Possibly an institutional practice and a school start time would be a perfect example of that, but homework could be, and those extracurricular demands you mentioned. And other structural roots would possibly include environmental factors, the pervasive use of electric lights at all hours, and even attitudes and social norms, such as the pervasive glorification of sleep deprivation that a lot of us feel is pretty common in our society. And obviously, if you're going to fix a sleep epidemic or really any public health problem, you really do have to address both individual roots and structural roots. But I think what's important to recognize here is that if there really are structural roots at work, you're only going to have a limited impact if you restrict your effort to the individual problems. So that makes sense, I think, but it still doesn't explain why should we focus on one particular structural root, that is school hours. And here the explanation is fairly straightforward. It's simply that of all the factors that we've looked at so far, the only one that has been shown to play both a major role and a remediable one are the school hours. In other words, we actually do have good empirical evidence that when you move bell times later, teenagers really do get more sleep. So we have a single achievable fix that affects a large percentage of the affected population. And that's the reason why there has been so much attention to this issue lately, why the U.S. Secretary of Education has voiced his support for later start times, and of course why the American Academy of Pediatrics recommended that schools for middle and high school not start before 8:30 in the morning. So we know a way we can actually help this problem, and it works and it can be done. Why on earth do we still run schools at these early hours? So of course that is what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this talk. And to do that really requires that we go back into time and look at how we got where we are. So I will be taking you on a very much of a whirlwind tour through the history of bell times in this country. And as you'll see, it's not just a systemic problem here, but it's also one we created for ourselves, and relatively recently at that. I have to preface it by saying that it really is a whirlwind tour, so I'm obviously going to be oversimplifying, leaving out details, but I think it gives you a pretty good idea of how we got here. And you also have to understand that this is still very much a work in progress in terms of understanding. Bell time history is still largely a black box, and part of this is because of the way education works in this country. It's a highly decentralized system. We have over 14,000 school systems and nearly 100,000 different schools within them, and they all kind of do things their own way. So you can't go to any kind of centralized clearinghouse and track how individual schools have shifted their bell times over time. And even if there were such a beautiful clearinghouse, it wouldn't contain the data you needed because, frankly, we simply don't measure what we don't think matters. And until really recently, nobody thought it mattered what time schools started. In fact, they didn't really think it mattered what time anything started. You might be able to go back and find how many hours kids were in school. You can possibly find how many hours people were at work. But when it comes to the exact time things started, it's just, there's no information. The good news, however, is historians have other more indirect ways of getting information. We can look at diaries and letters. We can look at some individual town records. And also even things like novels and song lyrics can tell you something about how things work. And from these kinds of indirect clues, we've been able to put together a pretty clear story about how we got here. And one of the things that popped out from that right away is that whatever it is we're doing right now, we haven't done very long. In fact, if you think about that one-room schoolhouse I showed you a few slides back, you realize how quickly things have changed. It wasn't that long ago that kids of all ages, whether they were 5 or 19, were sitting in a single room together for school 6 hours a day with a single teacher. And obviously they all started at exactly the same time of day. that time of day, even when the schools started dividing up into different grade levels, tended to be the same, whatever your age. And as far as we've been able to tell, until the mid-20th century, it usually was around 9 in the morning, rarely before. And even if kids were getting up earlier than 9 to slop the pigs or milk the cow or whatever it was they were doing, they weren't required to be in a classroom until around 9. You can see that even in New Haven. I thought this would be fun to share in this group. This is from 1878, a report of the New Haven Board of Education to the local town, and it's telling teachers when they need to be in a classroom. And you can tell from this that the way schools ran back then was really very different than today. Everybody, whatever their age, had to be in the classroom from 9 a.m. to noon. And then there was a leisurely 2-hour lunch break, and everyone came back for a 2-hour afternoon shift that went from 2 to 5. Obviously a very different experience than most of our teenagers have today. Also very different is the fact that most teenagers are even in school in the first place. It really wakes you up, so to speak, when you realize that it wasn't until 1917 that all of our states then in existence required kids even to go to elementary school. And for high school, it's even a more striking change. The statistics indicate that in the early 20th century, maybe 6, tops 11% of teenagers even went to high school. By 1970, these rates were over 90%, so you see a really quick change in the way we did things in a very short period of time. You see that on this graph as well, which is based on, sorry about that, based on the Census Bureau data that is broken down by race, and you can see that in 1850, just over half of the white students were enrolled in school, and almost nobody else at all was in school. But by the time you move 140 years down the line, you see that virtually everybody's going to school. So in a very short period of time, you see a massive change in the way we do things. And I always like to say that when you hear people talk about the way we've always done things, or they were fine the way we've always done things, you might consider that there was no way we've always done things. And if you want to talk about the way we do things now, you really only have to look back as far as about 1970 to see anything remotely like what we're doing today. 1970 in many ways was a watershed year, both in terms of sleep research as well as schools. Unfortunately, the two had virtually nothing to do with each other. 1970 in sleep research was a watershed year because that was the year when William Dement, who is often considered the father of sleep medicine, founded the very first sleep research center at Stanford. In schools, however, 1970 was a time when many trends that had been building throughout the whole century came to a point where we realized they were unsustainable. And these trends amount to 4 things. There were more schools. There were fewer schools. There were more students, fewer schools, more buses, and much longer commutes. Very expensive trends. And unfortunately, in the early 70s, this country was hit with a bunch of economic problems, starting with a stock market crash, a recession, inflation, a couple of energy crises, mounting fuel costs, and a lot of push on the schools to save money, especially on bus costs. And they came up with what they thought was a brilliant way to do this. Instead of sending all the kids to school at the same time, they could stagger the starting times of school for different ages, and they could take this gigantic fleet of buses, shrink it down, and recycle it several times over. At the same time, the schools were being pressured to extend the length of the school day, and they usually did this by tacking on a little bit of extra time at the beginning of the day. They did it incrementally through the 70s and 80s and into the early 90s, and communities adapted and everything was great. Except, of course, it wasn't great because, ironically, in the world of sleep research, in those very same years, sleep research was coming of age. And these were the years when Mary Carskadden and her team at Brown were doing the initial research into teen sleep needs and patterns, and they were documenting the circadian shift that you heard about earlier. They were finding ways to actually measure the impact of sleep deprivation, and other people were finding out the critical role of sleep in learning and memory consolidation. By the early 90s, it was becoming very clear to sleep researchers that the early hours that had been adapted in the past decade or so were really detrimental and were incompatible with teen sleep and health and learning. And to give credit where credit is due, the medical establishment jumped on this pretty quickly. As early as 1993, the Minnesota Medical Association called for later school start times. This is now, of course, over 20 years ago, but by then the damage had been done. So the lessons out of this quick tour of history are that however we do things now, we haven't done them. In fact, we haven't done them very long, and the shift to the early hours occurred before we understood teen sleep needs and patterns. And when we did move to the early hours, the primary impetus for change was budget. It was not teen sleep or health or well-being, which takes us where we are today, which is a society in which the bulk of adolescents are going to school at times that we know are out of sync with their sleep needs and patterns. Many schools today begin in the 7 a.m. hour, as you heard. They're ending in the early afternoon. And, of course, that means that wake-up and commute times are considerably earlier. As you'll see on the graph, fewer than 15% of our schools are starting after the 8:30 a.m. recommended by the AAP. The other thing that's jumped out in the past 20 years since we first started thinking this might be a problem is that there have been a number of studies showing that when you move bell schedules, you actually do have an impact on a number of different variables, including, of course, most pertinently, sleep. It's not necessarily what you'd expect. You might think if you move bell times, kids would just go to bed later. But it turns out that that hasn't been the case in the school systems that have made the change. And we first saw this in early 2000s, 2001, when Kyla Wallstrom at the University of Minnesota reported on a couple of school systems that had moved their bell times later. And she found not only did the teens get significantly more sleep on school nights, but there were reductions in a number of measures of mental health problems. There were improvements in school performance measures. There was less sleeping in class. And very interestingly, with the homework issue, I wanted to call your attention to this. The students actually took considerably less time doing their homework. The thought was maybe that if they were awake when they were doing their homework, it might take them less time to do it. So it's possible this isn't an independent variable at all. Now, subsequent to this first big study, there have been a lot of other studies showing exactly the same thing, replicating this, extending the findings, and culminating last year in the release of a really large study, multi-state study, again by Kyla Wallstrom and her group in Minnesota, showing the same things yet again, more sleep, fewer mood swings, but also less use of caffeine and energy drinks when school starts later, less use of illegal drugs, cigarettes, and alcohol, fewer teen car crashes again, and interestingly, improvement in a huge number of school performance measures. But even more interestingly were that these improvements in school performance measures were particularly strong among students from disadvantaged backgrounds. That was something we hadn't seen before, and it's come out in several other studies in recent years. For example, in this meta-analysis published by Brookings recently, school start times shift 1 hour later brought test scores up across the board, but with a benefit roughly twice as large as students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Another new finding in the past few years has been when schools move their bell times, the change actually is cost effective. That can be kind of surprising, but this seems to be true even within the narrow perspective of the school system. So in that same report published by Brookings, the economists found that even if you have to pay to add school buses, the overall benefit to cost ratio of a bell time change is at least 9-to-1 for high schools and 40-to-1 for middle school reform. And you have to remember, too, that these analyses don't even consider the benefits to society at large from having well-rested teens, nor do they consider the costs right now with the status quo. So, great, we have even more evidence that this is a good idea, and we're still left with the question about why on earth we continue to run schools at these hours. So my pal Schopenhauer, I think, pretty much nails it here. The issue really is that the issue is not science, and it rarely is science when it comes to public health or any kind of social reform. I mean, part of the problem, of course, is just a translation gap, where there's a trickle-down effect from the time you create knowledge in a lab and the time the word gets out to the clinic and gets out to the policymaker and the public. But even if the word does get out, it isn't always readily accepted. You see this in the history of public health all the time, with the classic example being cigarettes and lung cancer, where we had strong evidence for many, many years before there was a slightest budge in policy. And The problem really is that people don't make decisions on their health or policy on the basis of reason and evidence, much as we would like them to do that. They make these decisions based on things like emotion and values and their pocketbooks and politics, essentially. And this is why the classic approach to this problem, bringing good evidence to local school boards, simply hasn't worked in most cases. You see how it plays out. When you first bring the problem to a school system, you will often get a reaction based basically on attitudes about sleep and about teenagers to some degree. I'm talking about reactions like, change the bell time? How about you be a parent and get your kid to bed earlier? Did you ever think about that? Or how about we stop coddling these lazy teenagers? You know, I just threw ice water on my kid, got up fine. You get these reactions quite a bit. But probably even more concerning are reactions you get from people who say they understand the science, but they know that there are just insurmountable obstacles like the football. They will be put up before you by people who are really afraid that their lives are going to change if school bell times change. And honestly, these are understandable concerns when you think that about the fact that in our country, public school hours in many ways really do drive community life. And this is true even for people who don't have kids in the schools. When you suggest a change in a bell time, people immediately wonder about, well, wait a second, what's going to happen to traffic? And what's going to happen to my daycare arrangements? And how will this affect sports practices? And, you know, how are we going to pay for all these new buses? And these are understandable. They do almost always turn out to be unfounded and they are resolvable, but I can't overemphasize how powerful politically they are. Deb Delisle, who is at the U.S. Department of Education but used to be a superintendent herself, has said that one of the hardest things a superintendent can ever do is tinker with a bell schedule. People go absolutely bananas over it, and she's completely correct. It is a political hot potato. School officials know very well that if you propose a change to the schedule, you're going to get venomous pushback to the point where some have lost their jobs. And this is why, again, the solution to this problem does not involve bringing great science to school systems. I love the way Upton Sinclair put this. He said, it's hard to get a man to understand evidence when his job depends on his not understanding it. That is really what we're dealing with here. On the other hand, we know many school systems have actually done this. We have plenty of them listed on our website. And there have been so many, in fact, that Judy Owens and her team at Children's National Medical Center have generated what they call a blueprint for change, where they pulled out what works, what doesn't work, from the 70 or so school systems and about 1,000 schools that have managed to push their bell times back. And what you find in reading this report is a very clear message, which is that the issue, again, is not lack of evidence. The issue is a matter of priorities and a lack of will, political will particularly. You find again and again that when school communities put health and learning first, they really can and have found creative, affordable, feasible ways to run schools at healthy hours. So what is to be done? How do you build political will and change priorities? Well, there actually does seem to be an answer, and it seems to involve reframing this whole issue. Sleep and school start times really need to be seen as matters of public health and not negotiable school budget items. Again, I'm probably preaching to the choir. We're standing in the hallowed halls of a med school. It's probably clear to you this is a health problem or we wouldn't be talking about it. But out there in the world, school officials faced with sleep and school hours as just another budget item really do have to weigh these things against other pressing concerns, like whether to pay teachers or whether to buy instructional materials or keep that football team going. And the second you reframe the issue as matters of public health, everything immediately flips, so that what seemed difficult becomes, as Schopenhauer would say, inevitable. And it's just as unthinkable to run schools at these absurdly early times as it would be not to pay to heat them when the temperature is below 20 degrees. This is going to take, again, more than just bringing evidence to the school officials. It's really going to take, as every public health reform ever has in this country, a multi-pronged approach, which will involve efforts by a diversity of players on local, state, and national levels to push policy and change from above, and at the same time change behaviors and beliefs from below, involving things ranging from education and grassroots activism, but also through things like position statements and legislation and actually possibly even litigation. I know I'm supposed to leave a little time for questions, so I will try to stop. I have to put in a plug here with this audience for the involvement of health professionals in all of this multi-pronged approach. And I really can't emphasize this enough. If we really are going to reframe this issue and change priorities, health professionals are absolutely critical. They're critical in more traditional roles of things like patient education, of course, but also in extending, raising awareness amongst the larger public through social media and talking to the community, as well as through mentoring and modeling. The latter two may be particularly important, especially as we get more and more evidence that one-on-one contact is a very effective way of changing health behaviors as well as social norms. But it's also critically important that health professionals work with local advocacy groups, sometimes even lead them, as well as make themselves available as resources and sources of expert testimony in local, state, and national hearings. And of course, encouraging their professional associations to generate position statements. So if you'd like any more information on any of the things I was talking about, please check out our website, startschoollater.net. And there's also, and I keep pointing that I'm supposed to use this, I know, these other websites also provide a wealth of materials on this topic. And I will stop for questions. I did want to thank the people on this slide who provided a lot of the information that was mentioned in the talk, as well as, of course, thank all of you for listening to me. And I guess we should stop for questions.
So I'm going to moderate the questions, and Craig or Terra is going to answer them. I'm not sure what people outside can ask us questions that I'm not sure of. Are they able to?
The little arrow, if you just maximize that, then if anyone's texting or typing in, you can.
So okay, so I'm going to. You want to start off? Okay, so when I first started to talk to school superintendents, I was sort of amazed how they weren't interested in the science, just like you mentioned. In other words, they had other fish to fry, and the science was like the least important thing. The other thing that became apparent to me is that they didn't know any of the science, but they also didn't know that a child that was falling asleep in class early in the morning, that it wasn't because they didn't have cereal for breakfast. And there were these myths that children were falling asleep in class because they weren't eating well and they didn't have vitamins. And Kellogg's, in fact, I remember had commercials and ads in magazines sort of talking about that. So how do we get the science into the brains of the school superintendents? How do we do that, Terra?
Yeah, well, that's sort of been the focus of my entire career. I started out as a science writer trying to bring science to the public, and when I was younger, I thought, oh, you just have to explain things in words they can understand, and once you explain that, people will change. And so in my old age cynicism, I've come to understand that it's not about explaining science at all. They have to be motivated to hear it. Yeah. They have to have a reason to hear it. A lot of them will tell you, yeah, I understand the science, but this can't be done. And what I really believe after watching this phenomenon play out again and again and again is that they'll only believe the science if they have their priorities straight. And their priorities right now are not sleep. Sleep really, they really don't. If you really believe what you heard Craig talk about, how could you continue doing what you're doing? Clearly they don't deep down believe that these are real problems. So how do we build? We have to build it, and it's not just in those decision makers. Look, the school officials will do what the community wants them to do. And that's the case. So we have to build awareness about sleep in the entire community, and that's going to go beyond school start times and really change the way people think about sleep. Big project, I know.
So how do we get parents involved in this?
You usually can get parents involved while their kids are in high school. One of the problems that I found is that they're very involved for those 4 years when they're experiencing it, and then their kids, thank God, they're done. Mine are done, and they go, well, we're on to other things. you know, and then some new parents come along and take over. How do you keep momentum going over time? Well, that's exactly why I started school later, was this realization that there had to be some sort of continuity. And nobody was motivated to change this in a sustainable way. The science is very clear. The scientists are preaching to each other, and they all have been for a long time. But the community has nobody who's going to keep it going. So our hope is that by having a sustainable advocacy group joining with everybody else, that we're going to be able to push this. And certainly if you look at history, this is how change happens. It takes a few crazy people, and I'm one of them.
Well, I think you're fighting the good fight right now in Guilford, right? I was wondering if you could share some of your experience.
So, you know, actually, this man is Craig Mullen, who comes from Guilford. I met him in a school board meeting, and he was radicalized in the sleep later cause by watching kids older than his own get on the school bus at 6:15 in the morning. We've actually, I don't know if our superintendent is watching at home or not, our school board and our superintendent has been receptive. And we actually had a town meeting where Craig and I actually presented some of this evidence, and it was a good discussion. I'd say it was maybe 60% for change. The obstacle that we came across most recently, the school board said, great, we want to move school start times 20 minutes later. You know, our bell time is 7:25. Guilford is geographically the size of Manhattan and has like 20,000 people. And the busing is a huge problem. We run 4 bus runs, so there's all these logistical issues. So we sort of agreed with the superintendent to push this issue back for 1 year, and we're having an outside consultant come in and look at how can we make the busing more efficient. Because that seems, you know, when we say 7:25, there are kids that are dropped out of the high school at 7, and then the buses go out again. So you know, these are quite complex logistically, and busing is very expensive.
That was actually one of my questions about the whole economics of it. And then, are they going out then to pick up the kindergartners? I mean, and the question is it the kindergartners who should start early if there's, you know, a kind of allocation of resources?
Well, in our town, they talk about, well, we're going to move everybody 20 minutes later. Well, the elementary school kids start at 9 in the morning.
Right.
So they're going to be going 9:20 to...
But what I'm saying is,
yeah.
I mean, in terms of the whole sleep cycle, does it make more rational sense for the younger kids to start earlier?
I totally agree with you. And Terra, I know, has talked a lot about the opposite of this, is having little kids get on the bus in the dark looks bad.
The bottom line is that no matter what solution you propose, however rational it may be, if people don't want to change, they're going to come up with some reason, and that's one of them. Okay? But what comes out in the blueprint for change, which I highly recommend if you're really seriously thinking about making this change, they make it very clear that when communities want to do this, there's no one-size-fits-all solution, but they sit down, they bring all the stakeholders to the table, they educate the community about sleep, and then they say, okay, well, the priority is we have to do this, what can we do? And it does require some sacrifice. You do have to reprioritize. You might have to get rid of something you think is absolutely essential. But you've decided that actually running schools at healthy times is as important as giving the kids breakfast.
Yeah.
And when you decide that, other things will have to shift. But what those are will vary from community to community.
So what has been your experience in terms of what shifted, what had to give when it moved back? Was it that they had to spend more for buses?
Sometimes it's money, although this has been done many times at no cost. For example, in Arlington, Virginia, the superintendent wanted to do it. And he brought all these stakeholders together, sat them down at a table, and he said, find a way to start high school after 8 at no added cost. Guess what? They did. I don't know exactly what they did, but they just changed the way they did things. We had a seminar in Maryland a couple years ago where people came out and they said, you know, we figured it out. We had no choice. And by the way, when they moved these start times earlier, nobody asked the community at all. They just did it, you know. People do really adjust to school hours, not vice versa. They're just afraid that they won't. I mean, it's economically reasonable. If the school hours are different, the daycare providers will change the time they provide daycare. The Parks and Recreation will change those hours. And by the way, the traffic patterns are largely driven by the school hours. So, but this extrapolation and speculation is strong.
Can I ask you a question, picking up on what you just said, between leadership of the school board and the superintendent to make the change and getting the community to buy in? Because as your quotes ably demonstrated, to get this kind of status quo change and to wait till you get a tipping point of, 51% of the voters would go forward,
Right.
or the parents, could take a very, very long time. So can you comment on that? I mean, is
Yeah.
leadership that needs to happen with a bit of buy-in, or do you have to wait till you get a majority buy-in, which could be a 5-year process?
Right, well, again, the blueprint for change deals with all these things, pulls out these factors that work, and they definitely conclude there's no one-size-fits-all, but a leader is absolutely necessary, not sufficient, but necessary. If you don't have strong support from the superintendent or somebody in an equivalent position of power, this will not happen. I've seen plenty of superintendents who have been for this change and still couldn't do it because the community support wasn't there. But without leadership from on high, it isn't going to happen. Absolutely not. Any precedent for state legislature? Well, right now, in fact, my team in Maryland is testifying at the Maryland State Senate. We had a bill passed last year in the Senate, in the House. That was the first state legislation anywhere in this country, and it was simply for a study by the State Department of Health on this issue. The study was done, and by the way, concluded that school should be starting later. Bill was for a certification and recognition program, but yeah, we have a bill in play in Massachusetts now. Maine is having a hearing tomorrow. There are about 7 states that have legislation going, and there have been national legislation proposed since 1998 by Zoe Lofgren. It has never passed, but it's just been reintroduced.
It
And
comes
that-
up every year.
every
year it's
Yeah.
introduced and it
Yeah.
never gets passed.
Yeah. But the fact that we got a bill passed in Maryland last year is a sign of progress. And that it may take that. As I said, it is really going to take multi-level pushes from the local, state, and national.
And again, it reminds me of the concussion legislation, I mean, in terms of how it resorts, how it catches on, and again, it ends up being state legislated, at least for concussion
Right.
laws.
You see it in the secondhand smoke, you see it in concussions, you see it in the drunk driving. There's a lot of legislation on a lot of levels. There's a lot of grassroots advocacy. There are all kinds of factors.
In the medical field, you're probably aware of this, that trainees used to work 120 hours a week. And within the last 10 years, all those rules changed, and they changed by the accrediting boards who said we can't have this anymore. And basically they're down to like 80 hours, which still sounds terrible, but a lot better than 100 or 120 hours. And so you need someone to basically say this is what's going to happen, and we're not going to discuss this. We've seen the science, and we agree with the science, and this is what we are going to do. And so somebody with authority needs to be able to actually say something and enforce it. And the way they enforced it, actually, as I recall, Yale was one of the first places that lost accreditation of the program. I think they temporarily lost the accreditation for their surgery program because they violated the rules when they were first introduced. A lot of hospitals thought that they could get away with it, but when you have rules and you think you get away with it and you lose accreditation, that's really important. Yes.
Just going on Terra, Fairfax County, it's one of the biggest school districts to make a change. There's a lot of published information about that, but I'm sure you've studied it closely. Are there any insights, any tipping points, anything that one can learn from that particular case? Because they did a very methodical job of it.
Right, well, the two first names you see up there on that list, Daryl Drobnich was on the consulting team with Judy Owens, who did the study of Fairfax County and led to the change. Phyllis Payne is the grassroots advocate who has been pushing there since the early 2000s for this to happen, and she's now our implementation director at Start School Later. So yes, a lot of the things I've been saying come right out of lessons from Fairfax County, and we feel if they can do it, anyone can do it. Very, very large county. They started school at 7:20. They'll be starting at 7:40 or at 8 o'clock next year. So it's a big change. Not perfect.
Listen.
Are most of the, sort of a follow-up question, most of these, is it requiring a whole phase shift so everything moves later? Does that almost seem to be the easiest way? Does it seem like more people are flip-flopping high school, elementary?
It varies quite a bit. The problem with just the shift later, the good part about shifting everyone is that it's usually free.
Right.
But a lot of elementary schools, as you were hearing, start very late already.
Right. So I was like actually falling to the floor and fainting when I heard them say that because
Right.
those
Oh my God, the little kids will be starting school. Right. By the way, that's a good example of how a lot of these objections are truly bogus because people say, well, if we start high school later, how will we get to work? And then you kind of wonder, well, how do you get to work now when elementary school starts at 9:15?
Right.
You work these things out is what you do, but but yeah, that's not the only solution by any means. A lot of times the bell times are condensed, and a lot of schools don't run their buses as efficiently as they think they do. That's actually one of the things they did in Fairfax was they started using software to route buses in this gigantic school system. They were actually doing it by hand, which they do where I live as well. With push pins on a board, and we're talking about $1 billion school system.
In other countries, that problem isn't so major because they have more schools.
Right.
And so kids can usually walk to school and they don't need buses. And certainly that was the case where I raised my kids
Right.
dependent on school.
Well,
Yeah.
right, and by the way, this is why this is less of a problem in urban areas, which often don't use school busing, and they do use public transport, and they've never really had to move their bell times back. On the other hand, it's why we have trouble getting funding for our cause, because everyone wants to give their money to inner city problems, and they don't realize that these problems, they're problems
everywhere.
out there, they're everywhere.
Yeah. Anyways, we're going to have to end because the system is being taken over by another. Thank you very much. That was great.